This is the first video for the 6-2F lesson, solve equations using squares and nth roots. I'd like you to pause the video and consider these two questions, which are identical in the Desmos slides, just using maybe some verifies or guess and check, and then unpause the video and see if you're correct. And then we will talk about a more formal way to solve these. So hopefully you thought about this. And 5, let's just check, does 5 actually work within this um, equation? And our first equation is, one second, got a technical problem here, is x squared equals 25. So we'll plug in 5 and it checks out. And the other number that maybe you stumbled upon was, well, what about negative 5? Negative 5, if we plug it in, then we do wrap it in parentheses, will check out. And so to answer this question, no, 5 is not the only answer. In fact, there are two answers for this equation. And the reason for this is that when we plug things in and they get squared, if we plug in a positive or a negative, and aside from that, they're the same numbers or they're opposites essentially, we will get the same final answer. And we will then sometimes write this as x equals negative 5 and 5, or 5 actually, technically. We also sometimes do plus or minus 5. So we kind of have now stumbled upon sort of the key concept here. We're going to solve equations. We're starting to see that if there is an exponent 2, then we're going to have two answers. It's almost like a little hint. If we see a 2, we're going to have two answers. And the other equation you were to consider was, well, then what about this? The square root of x equals 5. So let's try 25, square root of 25. Square root of 25 is in fact 5. So that checks out. And then what about if we plug in negative 25? Well, we can't square root a negative, so this isn't going to be equal. This is going to be false. And so this is actually correct, that this has only one answer. And the answer is in fact 25. So we come to box these answers as well. A hint here that, which is that a square root is only, from what we can currently gather, going to have one answer. So some of them are going to have two answers, even though this one looks like one answer, and some are going to have one answer. And the other thing is we start to get confused about this whole plus or minus. We're only doing that when we have an even exponent. We'll see that as we go through the lesson. Down here, I did not put a negative in front because whenever I have a square root that's just there, like it is here, it's understood that there's an imaginary plus sign, that this is understood to be a positive root. We're doing this here because we are introducing the square root when we solve. And we'll keep talking about that. And I'm sure there's some questions about that as we look at the examples below. So we're going to look at each one. We're going to show the algebraic steps, and we're also going to justify what we did. So which inverse operation will we do to get rid of this exponent 2 or a square? We're going to square root both sides. So we'll write square root. We normally don't justify these. We're just doing it here for practice. And we're going to show the square root on both sides. And we're going to put x equals. And when I introduce the square root, or I see a 2 in my original equation, exponent 2, I'm going to do plus or minus, and the square root of 100 is 10. So my two answers are positive, negative 10. Or I can list them out as negative 10, comma 10. B, we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to do a square root. And as I do this, I'm probably also going to do a plus or minus, but wait, I'm actually square rooting a negative, and I'm not allowed to do that. If I try to type this in my calculator, in other lessons, we talked about how that doesn't work. And so I'm going to say no solution. So also some of these are going to have two answers, no answers, or one answer, like we saw with absolute value. And then to undo a square root, we're going to square both sides. So we'll show that. Put a little 2 and a little 2. We'll have x equals 81. This one does not have two answers because it doesn't follow that trick that I said with an exponent 2 that's already typed there. If I try to plug in negative 81 here, it's not going to work. So these square root equations, I'm more than likely going to get one answer, and we'll kind of look at some other examples. Like, what about this one? Square root of x equals a negative number? That doesn't make any sense. I can't square root something and have a negative when there's an understood that this is the positive root. Just like when I write a number like 5, it's understood that it's positive. So this one's actually no solution. I can try to square both sides, but it's not going to do me any good. And I guess if I did try to solve this, the inverse operation would be squaring on both sides. And so kind of to recap one more time, if we have exponent 2, we're going to get plus or minus answers. It's best to write those down almost right away. We're going to watch out for a negative under the radical. If we need to undo a square root, we're going to square both sides. We're not going to get two answers. And we're also going to maybe watch out for this, that we have a square root equal to a negative, and we're going to just stop.